Audrey sat at her desk, her eyes focused on the screen, her ears listening intently to the sound of the phone ringing in the quiet of the 911 call center. It was an ordinary morning, just like any other. But this time, the ringing was different from the usual frantic and urgent emergency calls. This was a soft, weak call, as if from a distant place, where a pain beyond words could not be expressed. She picked up the phone, her voice calm and professional. 911, what assistance do you need? On the other end of the line, a young voice came through, weak but sincere. Hello, my name is Brian. I just want a pizza. Audrey was slightly taken aback, not fully understanding. A pizza? She asked, trying to remain calm. Brian, can you tell me where you are? Brian's voice continued, lost and filled with sadness. Yes, it's been 3 days. I haven't eaten anything. Audrey was quick to respond. Where are your parents? Can I talk to them? My parents are sleeping, and I can't wake them up, Brian answered, his voice faint. The boy's words were like a warning sign. Audrey immediately felt something was wrong. Each word he spoke made her more tense. She couldn't sit still, her instincts telling her there might be hidden danger. Brian, Audrey asked, trying to keep her voice calm but serious, can you tell me if anyone else is at home, or are you alone? Brian remained silent for a long moment before answering. No, it's just me. I'm really scared. No one is helping me. Audrey could sense the desperation in the boy's voice. She couldn't let this continue. Immediately, she relayed the information to the police officers, requesting them to come right away. She explained that she wasn't sure about the boy's condition or his parents, but something was wrong, and it needed to be checked immediately. Within a few minutes, she received confirmation from the officers. 2 were dispatched immediately to the address that Brian had provided. Brian, the police are on their way to help you. Try to stay calm. Don't worry. Everyone will protect you. Audrey reassured the boy once more. Even though her heart was filled with worry, she continued to monitor the call, not taking her eyes off the phone, her heart tightening as she thought about what might be happening in Brian's house. Was the boy safe? Were his parents really just asleep? Or was something more dangerous going on? The unanswered questions kept swirling in her mind. When officers Chad and Madeline arrived, they were met with a horrifying scene. A house in a state of disrepair, peeling paint and neglected, everything looking like it hadn't been cared for in a long time. The air felt heavy, as if the house had been hiding too many secrets in its shadows. As they stepped inside, they immediately felt the tension, as if everything here had come to a standstill, frozen in time. The front door opened, and a foul smell of decay and chemicals hit them, making them grimace in discomfort. In the cluttered space, the air was thick with the scent of strong cleaning products mingled with something rotting. They moved into the living room, where 2 adults were lying motionless on the floor, clearly showing signs of an overdose. Sergeant Chad quickly called for an ambulance, his voice tense but steady. Immediate medical assistance required, 2 victims showing signs of overdose, unable to breathe on their own. Nurse Caroline, who was standing nearby, immediately sprang into action. She quickly assessed the condition of the victims, first checking their pulse and respiration. Confirming that the 2 adults were in cardiac arrest, she began performing CPR with calmness and professionalism. Meanwhile, Officer Madeline searched for the young boy, Brian, who had made the 911 call. She walked through the dimly lit room, each step echoing in the silence as if the space was holding its breath. As she entered the room, she couldn't help but feel a suffocating sense of stillness, a heavy silence that filled the air. At that moment, young Brian remained seated in a small corner of the room, his wide-open eyes staring blankly into nothingness. The boy was emaciated, his body seeming little more than skin and bones. His skeletal frame was visible, as though even a gentle breeze could cause him to collapse. Despite the passage of time, the bruises on his skin had not faded, the wounds seeming like indelible marks of his torment over the past months. The dark bruises around his wrists and ankles spoke of pain, bondage, and abuse that went beyond the physical, extending to the emotional. Upon seeing Madeline, Brian flinched, as though expecting a sudden blow or a harsh scolding. Her footsteps seemed to be unreachable to him, even though Madeline only wished to offer a reassuring touch. The boy dared not move, not even to breathe heavily, as if afraid that any movement might hurt someone, or even himself. Madeline gently set the food container down in front of Brian. The boy gazed at it intently, his thin hands trembling as he opened the lid. Without saying a word, Brian began to eat voraciously, each bite seeming insufficient to quell the hunger that had tormented him for days. He ate quickly, his eyes never leaving the plate, but his face still carried the deep fear and suffering within him. Madeline sat beside him, her voice soft as she spoke. "Brian, you don't need to rush like that. Take your time. No one is going to take your meal away." She looked at him with a compassionate gaze, trying to offer him some comfort. Brian paused for a moment, looking up at her with a confused expression. I'm really hungry. I haven't eaten in a long time," he said hoarsely, his voice so weak as if he couldn't bear it any longer. Madeline felt her heart tighten as she heard the boy's words. She gently placed her hand on Brian's shoulder, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's okay. You don't have to worry anymore. You're safe now. I'll always be here to help you." Madeline looked at the boy, her heart aching. She imagined her own daughter, Emily, about Brian's age, sitting at the dinner table with her family, surrounded by everything, food and love. Madeline thought of the dinners she prepared for her daughter. When Emily excitedly shared stories about her happy day at school, her eyes full of innocence and joy, she wondered why Brian hadn't been able to experience those things. Why did he have to endure his wounds in silence, in loneliness and fear? After Brian finished his meal, Madeline gently asked, trying to create a safe space for him, "Brian, where did those bruises come from? Can you tell me?" She tried to keep her voice as soft as possible, though a feeling of unease bubbled up inside her. Brian remained silent, his eyes unable to meet hers, instead staring at the empty plate. After a long, heavy pause, he finally spoke in a small voice, almost inaudible. "Maybe it's because my parents, they have bad days." His voice trembled, as if each word was a deep wound in his heart. Madeline felt her heart tighten. Brian's words were so painful that she could hardly bear it. The boy had not only suffered physical pain, but was also carrying the emotional burden of protecting the very people who had hurt him. "Don't worry, Brian," Madeline said, trying to keep her tone comforting, though her heart ached deeply. "I understand. No one has the right to hurt you, and I won't let that happen anymore. I promise you, you won't have to suffer alone anymore." Brian looked up at Madeline, his eyes glimmering with a faint hope, but also filled with fear. He didn't know who to trust, but when he heard Madeline's words, it was as if a small light was shining in the endless darkness of his life. After Brian finished the first meal he had in days, Madeline gently led him outside. She couldn't let him suffer any more. Taking him to the hospital was necessary to ensure his safety. At the hospital, Madeline, along with the medical staff, gently escorted Brian to the examination room. Brian seemed uneasy, his eyes still full of fear when he saw the doctor and nurse, as though he wasn't used to receiving care from others. But this time, no one was going to hurt him. They were only people trying to help. The doctors began to examine the boy, noting every wound, from bruises to old scars. Each mark on Brian's body was a painful reminder of the past, a life filled with harm and fear that he had to endure. The head doctor shook his head, looking at Madeline with eyes full of sorrow. "This boy has not only suffered physical harm, but also severe psychological trauma. These wounds are clearly signs of ordinary abuse, not just ordinary scratches. He needs ordinate polypharmacy support, and he requires special care to recover." Madeline looked at Brian, her heart in pain but also filled with determination. "Brian," she said gently, "I'll help you. I promise you, from now on, no one will hurt you again. You will be loved and cared for, like you deserve." Brian, Ablon spoke softly. "You've been so strong, you don't have to hide anymore. I will help you, I promise. If you tell the truth, everything will get better." The boy didn't respond immediately. A minute passed, then another, before he spoke, his voice weak like a whisper in the wind. You don't understand. If I tell, my parents will be arrested. And I don't want them to go to jail. I can't do it." Madeline listened, her heart heavy. This boy, despite having endured so much pain, still didn't want to break up his family. Still didn't want his parents to face the consequences of their brutal actions. It was a sacrifice that even adults sometimes couldn't make. And now, Brian was shouldering this responsibility in complete fear. Madeline gently took his hand, patting him comfortingly, like a mother soothing her child. "Brian," she said, "you have the right to be safe. You don't have to carry their decisions. You don't have to suffer through this alone anymore. If you tell the truth, you'll never be abandoned. I'll be here, helping you through it." The boy looked up at Madeline, his eyes filled with tears, not saying anything more. But in that gaze, something had changed, like a protective shell slowly cracking. He whispered softly, "Dad, Mom, they hit me. Mom always yelling. And Dad, when he's drunk, he hits me. I didn't do anything wrong, but they just keep doing it." His voice choked. Each word felt like a wound tearing open the pain he had kept hidden inside. Madeline felt the turmoil in the boy's heart. Brian's innocent eyes were now filled with fear and disappointment, as though he no longer believed in the world around him. As for Brian's parents, after being rushed to the hospital, they gradually recovered, but they were faced with serious charges of abuse, drug use, and mistreatment of their own son. Though at first they stubbornly denied everything, as the truth began to surface, especially when they had to face Brian's eyes, everything seemed to collapse. Both of them, once tough and stubborn, now lacked the confidence to justify their actions. They were silent. Their heads hung low, their eyes vacant. It seemed as though everything they had done over the years was now coming back to them, and they couldn't escape. The mother, who was the first to speak, her voice choked with emotion, unable to hold back her tears. "Brian, I'm truly sorry. I don't know why. It's just, I was too greedy. I didn't think about you." She sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I've abused drugs. I've mistreated you for the welfare money. I don't deserve to be your mother." Brian stood still, his eyes filled with pain and fear. He looked at her, unable to speak. Inside, every word was like a knife cutting deep into his young heart. How many times had he lived in this fear? But now, the truth had been revealed. Brian's father, his hands trembling and his eyes filled with regret, also spoke, his voice low and hoarse, full of guilt. I can't forgive myself. We abandoned you, just for money. Just because we wanted other things, and forgot about our son. I don't deserve to be your father." He lowered his head, as if all his strength had drained away. Despite the pain, Brian could feel the change in his parents' attitude. He couldn't respond right away, as his heart was too wounded. After a long silence, he whispered softly, Why did you do this? I just wanted to be loved. I just wanted a family. Why me?" The mother lowered her face, unable to look her son in the eyes. I was wrong. I can't forgive myself. I knew you needed love, but I only thought about myself." Brian's father, though in pain from realizing the truth, still tried to say more, his voice choked with emotion. "Brian, you were never a tool. We were wrong, so wrong. Everything is too late now." Both of them fell silent, their eyes full of guilt, but they now knew that no apology could ever make up for what they had done. But at least, when facing their son, they realized that the love they had never given him was now the only thing he truly needed. Brian said no more. He just looked at his parents, his eyes filled with tears, and in that look, it seemed as though he was searching for something. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps comfort, but definitely a promise of a different future. A future without abuse, without shameful pain, only love and care that he deserved. The three of them, though none of them spoke further, all understood in their hearts that, though it was too late, this was the moment when love and regret were finally confronted. Brian sat alone in the hospital room, the dim lights on the ceiling reflecting on his thin face. A numbness spread throughout his body, as if everything around him was gradually fading. He couldn't believe what had happened, that the people he called his parents, the ones he had always longed for love from, could treat him like this. The tears he had held back for so long now fell freely. He didn't know how to feel anymore. Regret, anger, or fear. All the mixed emotions churned inside Brian, making him feel as though he were sinking into an endless mire, unable to escape. Why me? That question repeated over and over in his mind, like an echo with no answer. His parents had now been taken to jail, and whether he wanted to accept it or not, Brian understood that it was the consequence of their actions. But the truth was, there was no comfort in that for him. Brian did not feel joy at seeing his parents face the law. He only felt empty and lost. It felt as though a part of him had been taken away forever. The years of living in fear, with both physical and emotional scars, had now been exposed to the light, but all he had was an overwhelming sense of loneliness. With nowhere to run, the boy glanced out the hospital window. The city lights outside seemed so far away, much like his future. A murky future, with no one by his side. Who would take care of him? Who would love him like a real child? Those thoughts gradually consumed his mind. Suddenly, Sergeant Madeline approached, causing Brian to snap out of his thoughts. Even though he still had many fears inside, at least now he had someone who cared. "Brian," Madeline said softly, walking closer, "I will take you to my home, and I will take care of you like my own child. Do you agree?" The boy looked up, his eyes filled with worry, but also a glimmer of hope. In that moment, despite being overwhelmed by fear, he began to sense a small measure of safety, a little peace that he had never dared to dream of. A part of him, which seemed to have been paralyzed for so long, suddenly came to life, allowing him to believe that there might be a place where he truly belonged, a place where there was no more pain, no more loneliness. However, when they got home, things were not as easy as Madeline had imagined. Her husband, Tim, looked at Brian with an expression of discomfort before turning to Madeline, his disapproval evident. "Madeline, are you really going to raise this boy?" Tim asked, his voice filled with doubt. "Our family has gotten used to the way things are, you know that. And this kid, he's going to be a burden. Do we have enough to support him?" Madeline ignored the opposition. She knew she couldn't turn her back on Brian. "You don't understand, Tim," she replied, her gaze firm. "This boy has suffered too much. We can't abandon him now. I won't let him feel abandoned again." But what Madeline didn't expect was the opposition from their young daughter, Emily. At that moment, Emily, only 8 years old, stood by the door, looking in with eyes full of worry. "Mom, why do we have to take care of that boy?" Emily asked, her voice sad and anxious. "I don't want a new friend in the house. I just want to be mine." Madeline looked into her daughter's eyes, feeling as if she were standing at a major crossroads in her life. She couldn't imagine what would happen if Emily didn't accept Brian. She understood her daughter's feelings, but she also knew that she couldn't pass up the opportunity to give Brian a better life. "Emily," Madeline said gently, "I know you might be feeling unhappy, but Brian needs love and care. I want you to help, to love him as a member of our family." However, the silence from Emily made Madeline's heart feel like it was breaking. Despite her attempts to convince her, the worries of the entire family grew, and once again, Brian's feelings were pushed aside. The boy sat quietly, his hands clenched tightly, his eyes fixed on the window, as if trying to find an escape. Although Madeline had brought warmth into his life, in Brian's heart, the fear and feeling of unworthiness still lingered. "Madeline, could you take me to the social welfare center?" the boy said, his voice weak but determined. "I don't want to be a burden to you. I just want you to be happy with your family." Madeline looked at the boy, her heart tightening. She walked over and gently placed her hand on Brian's shoulder. "You're not a burden, Brian," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I love you, and I want to take care of you. You don't need to worry about my happiness, because my happiness is when you're with me. I won't abandon you." 2 months passed, and the big change in Brian's life began to gradually unfold. After long conversations with Madeline and staying up late with her, Brian began to understand that he deserved a better life, a place where he could live without fear or worry. Then one day, Madeline brought good news to Brian. An elderly woman named Madison, who lived alone nearby, had decided to adopt him. Mrs. Madison, with her kind eyes and big heart, saw something in Brian that she couldn't ignore. She looked at him as a part of her family, ready to give him the love and care he needed. "Brian," Madeline said, smiling gently as she brought him to Mrs. Madison's house, "this is Mrs. Madison's house. She will take care of you like her own child. You will live in a home full of love, and you will have the chance to learn and grow." When Madeline brought Brian to Mrs. Madison's house, the boy was still quite shy and anxious. He stood silently beside Madeline, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Madison, who was smiling gently at him. Mrs. Madison walked over, her gaze warm and kind. She knelt down, looked into Brian's eyes, and spoke softly. "Hello, you're Brian, right? I'm very happy to meet you." Brian lowered his head slightly, too shy to look her in the eye. "Yes, ma'am," he answered quietly. Madeline smiled and patted the boy's shoulder reassuringly. "Mrs. Madison is a good person, Brian. She will take good care of you, and you won't have to worry anymore," Mrs. Madison continued, her voice still gentle, but filled with resolve. "Don't be afraid, Brian. This is your home now, and you will never have to feel alone again. I'll always be here, to help you, to love you. You can call me Mrs. Madison, or if you want, you can call me Mom. I don't have children, but from today on, I want you to be my child." Brian looked up at Mrs. Madison, his eyes full of uncertainty and fear. He opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. Finally, he whispered, his eyes red, "You're so kind to me, but can I stay here for a long time? I don't want to be abandoned again." Mrs. Madison gently hugged the boy, pulling him into her arms as if he were her only child. "You will never be abandoned, Brian," she said, her voice full of love. "I promise you, I will always be here to care for and protect you. No matter what happens, no matter if you make mistakes or feel sad, I will be the one by your side." Brian gently nestled his head into Mrs. Madison's embrace, feeling as though he had finally found a real home. Though his heart was still full of fear and doubt, in this moment he felt the warmth and love he had never known before. From that point on, Brian, once a lonely boy, now had a new family. Step by step, he learned to trust others, open his heart, and feel genuine love. Mrs. Madison was not just an adoptive mother, but also a companion, always by his side, encouraging him and sharing every joy and sorrow of life. Although they no longer lived together, Madeline, the sergeant who had once fostered Brian, still visited the two of them regularly. She always felt happy seeing Brian smile, watching him grow in an environment filled with love. Madeline knew she had made the right choice in bringing Brian into Mrs. Madison's family, where he not only had a home, but also true affection. Ultimately, Brian's story is a testament to the power of love and resilience. Though the boy had endured many painful and lonely days, the care, attention, and love from those around him helped him rediscover his faith in life. This story reminds us that no matter how difficult life may be, As long as there is love, each person can find the light at the end of the dark road. And sometimes, even a small light can be enough to illuminate the way for souls in need of rescue.